and see what happened." She stood still. He turned. He was taller than the intelligence reports had described, which in her experience meant the people who had written the reports had been afraid of him, and their fear had made them imprecise. Broad through the shoulders, the kind of physical authority that was not performed, but simply structural, built into the frame. Dark hair, not the silver gold she had expected from court paintings. Eyes the color of deep amber, warm and very direct. He looked at her. She had been looked at by powerful men before. She knew the taxonomy of it: the assessing look, the dismissive look, the predatory look, the political look that was calculating even when it appeared warm. She had a response prepared for each of them. She did not have a response for the way he looked at her. He looked at her as if he recognized her. Not her face, he had never seen her face. Something else. Something she could not immediately name that made the back of her neck feel strange. "Good morning," he said. His voice was even and unperformed. "Good morning, Your Majesty." She curtsied with exactly the right depth for Lady Voss. "I apologize for intruding. I was not aware the gardens were there not reserved," he said. "I prefer it when people use them." He looked back at the oak tree. "The frost does something interesting to the structure of it. Makes you see the bones." She looked at the tree. She was not performing interest. The frost had in fact done something interesting to the structure of it, had outlined every branch in white, so the whole architecture of the thing was suddenly legible in a way it wasn't in other seasons. "It looks like a map," she said, before she had decided to say anything. He turned back to her. "Yes," he said. "Exactly like that." He paused. "You're newly arrived. Lady Voss, I believe." "Yes, Your Majesty." He nodded. He looked at her for one more moment with that expression she had no category for. "I hope you find the court worthwhile," he said. He walked back toward the palace. She stood in the frost-white garden and looked at the oak tree and felt the doubt she had packed for herself shift in her chest like something finding a new position. She told herself it was nothing. She did not believe herself. She spent the rest of the morning building her access. This was the methodical part, the part she was best at, the patient construction of presence, inserting herself into the social geography of the court in a way that felt organic rather than engineered, becoming familiar to the right people at the right pace so that by the end of the week her presence would be unremarkable, a background feature of the court landscape, which was exactly where she needed to be. She was good at this. She had been doing it since she was 18, when the organization had found her in the wreckage of a life that had left her with two options, and she had chosen the option that kept her alive. 8 years of becoming other people in other places for specific purposes. 8 years of building access and executing outcomes and walking away. She had never let herself become the instrument of someone innocent. This was the rule she had made for herself, the private line she had drawn, the thing that let her sleep on the nights she could sleep. She researched targets before she took assignments. She needed to know what she was being paid to remove from the world. She had researched Aldrich of Astravin. She had found the intelligence reports, the testimony from border territories, the records of his governance. She had found reasonable evidence of a firm ruler and contested evidence of a cruel one, and the contested evidence had been provided exclusively by sources with direct financial interest in his removal, and this was the thing that had generated the doubt she had packed, without telling anyone. She needed more information. She spent the morning learning where to find it. The court librarian was a small, precise man named Edvin, who had clearly been keeping track of the king's official records for 30 years, and who, when approached by a lady of evident intelligence with specific questions about land governance policy in the Northern Territories, brightened with the particular joy of a person whose expertise was rarely sought by people who actually wanted it. She sat in the library for 2 hours and listened to Edvin explain policy with the devotion of a man in love with his subject. and she filed everything he said in the careful catalog she maintained in her mind, and the picture that assembled itself did not match the picture she had been given. Not corrupt. Not cruel. Not even particularly self-serving, his governance records showed systematic attention to the outer territories, the poorer regions, the places that powerful rulers traditionally ignored in favor of the rich ones. The northern land reforms had been unpopular with the noble families. They had been enormously beneficial to the farming communities. She left the library and walked back to her rooms and stood at the window looking at the winter gardens and thought about the people who had sent her and what they stood to gain from a king who had taken land back from the noble families and redistributed it downward. She thought about the forged letters of introduction and the vial under her thumbnail and the deadline. She thought about the way he had looked at the frost on the oak tree. She went to dinner. He was there this time, at the head of the long table, performing the social function of a ruler hosting court with the competent ease of someone who had been doing it for years. She watched him from her position 3 seats down on the right side, behind 2 other guests, a vantage point that allowed observation without being directly in his line of sight. He was a good host. Not effusive, he did not perform warmth he did not feel, which she recognized because she spent all her time performing things she did not feel, and she could identify its absence. He listened when people spoke to him. He answered questions directly. He deflected the more manipulative conversational approaches with a courtesy that revealed he knew exactly what they were. Once, across the table and the intervening guests, his eyes found hers. Not searching, she had the sense he had simply known where she was in the room without looking, and was confirming a piece of information he already had. She held his gaze for exactly the right number of seconds for Lady Voss, and then looked away. Her pulse was doing something she did not authorize. After dinner, the court gathered in the reception room, which was where the informal business of winter court happened, the conversations that did not belong at the formal table. She positioned herself near the bookshelves, which gave her a clear view of the room while providing the natural cover of someone who preferred books to socializing. He crossed the room to her, not obviously. He moved through several conversations on the way, naturally, the path appearing organic. But he arrived at the bookshelves with the air of someone who had been heading there all along. "Lady Voss," he said, "Your Majesty." He looked at the shelves. He pulled a book, not randomly, deliberately, a history of Astrovan's eastern territories, and offered it to her. "If you're interested in the region," he said, "this one is more accurate than most." She took the book. Their fingers did not touch. She was aware of the proximity of his hand. "How did you know I was interested in the eastern territories?" she asked carefully. "Edvin," he said simply. "He tells me when guests use the library. He considers it the highest compliment, and I agree with him." She looked at the book. Then she looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression again, the one she had no category for, the one that suggested recognition, as if he was reading something in her face that she had not written there intentionally. "You ask better questions than most guests," he said quietly. Edvin mentioned that too. She held his gaze. "I have a lot of questions, Your Majesty. About the Eastern Territories," he said, "or about something else." It was said without pressure, simply openly, as if he were offering a door and leaving the choice of whether to open it entirely to her. "About governance," she said carefully, "about what makes a ruler's decisions worth trusting." He was quiet for a moment. "That," he said, "is a question I ask myself every day." He excused himself to attend to other guests. She stood at the bookshelves with the history of the Eastern Territories in her hands and the doubt shifting in her chest again, heavier now and more complex. 5 days left. She needed to stop having conversations with him. She was deeply concerned she was going to fail at this. On the 3rd day, she made a mistake. Not a professional mistake professionally, she was still perfectly calibrated. Lady Voss fully intact. Access building at exactly the right pace. No one in the court looking at her sideways. The mistake was personal, which was worse, because personal mistakes did not announce themselves clearly until they had already become something difficult to undo. She went back to the garden in the early morning. She told herself it was reconnaissance. The garden was part of the palace geography, and she needed to know it thoroughly. She told herself this while she walked the same frost-white path she had walked the first morning, and she did not examine too carefully why she walked it at the same hour. He was there. Of course he was there. He was standing at the oak tree again, but this time he was not looking at it, he was looking at her, as if he had been expecting her, which was alarming for reasons she did not fully want to name. "Lady Voss," he said. "Your Majesty." She kept her voice even. "I find I prefer the gardens before the court assembles." "So do I," he said. "For the same reason, I suspect." She stopped walking. "What reason is that?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "The garden doesn't want anything from you," he said, "at this hour. It's simply itself, and you can be simply yourself inside it." She said nothing. The frost breathed around them. She was aware of the precise accuracy of what he had said and the danger of that accuracy, the way it had found something real in her and pressed on it. "You do that," she said before she could stop herself. "Say things that are precise in unexpected ways." He almost smiled. "People tell me I'm too direct." "Direct isn't the same as precise," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." They walked. She did not plan to walk with him. It happened the way the conversation happened, through the accumulated gravity of two people moving in the same direction in a small garden. He walked with his hands behind his back, and she walked beside him, and they talked about the frost and the oak tree and the particular quality of winter light in Astroven, which was different from winter light in other regions because of the elevation and the way the cold came from the north carrying a particular clarity. She told him about the eastern mountains she had grown up near, not as Sarah, not as herself, but details real enough to be inhabited, the kind of specificity that made performance convincing. Except that the details she chose were real ones, the actual mountains, the actual cold, the actual silence of a high village in deep winter. She noticed herself doing this and could not stop. He listened with the full attention she was beginning to understand was simply how he listened, not a performance of engagement, but actual engagement, the thing itself. He told her about his first winter as king. He had been 23, his father gone 6 months, the weight of the governance still new enough to feel like borrowed clothing, too large across the shoulders. He had come to this garden every morning that winter, before the court assembled, for the same reason, to be in a space that did not require anything of him. She looked at his profile as he said this. The strong jaw, the amber eyes looking at the frost-bright trees. She thought about the vial. She thought, I cannot do this. And then, immediately with the force of 8 years of survival, you have to. She returned to her rooms and stood at the window for a long time. She needed information she did not have. Specifically, she needed to know who had sent her, and what they actually stood to gain, which she had not fully investigated before accepting the assignment because she had been given insufficient time and compelling pressure, and she had been less careful than she should have been, and now she was standing in a palace window 3 days from a deadline, holding doubt like a stone in her chest. She needed to get a message out. She spent the afternoon constructing it, not on paper, never on paper, but in the encoded system she had developed over years, a sequence of purchases from the market vendors near the south gate that would look like ordinary provisioning to anyone watching, and would transmit specific information to the contact she needed. She executed it on her afternoon walk with the precision of long practice. Then, She waited. That evening in the reception room, he sought her out again, which she was beginning to understand was a pattern, and she was also beginning to understand that it was not entirely one-sided, that she was not merely a target locating himself conveniently. She was positioning herself. She was choosing to be findable. She needed to stop doing that. She did not stop doing that. They talked about governance again. She asked him about the northern land reforms, the ones the noble families had hated. She asked carefully, from within the role, the intelligent, courtly interest of Lady Voss. He answered directly, which she had expected. He told her the policy had cost him 3 powerful alliances, and he would make the same decision again without hesitation. Because the people who benefited from it were the ones who had been systematically excluded from the consideration of every ruler before him, and the fact that recognizing them was politically inconvenient did not make it wrong. She looked at him. He looked back at her. He said, quietly, "You're trying to determine whether I'm worth something. I don't know why, but I've noticed it, and I want you to know that I don't mind. I'd rather be examined honestly than trusted blindly." She held very still. "Your Majesty," she began. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. "I'm simply telling you that whatever you're deciding, you have time to decide it properly." She thought, "If you knew what I was deciding, you would not be this calm." She thought, "Or perhaps you would." She thought, "I am in serious trouble." The message came back on the 4th day. She found it in the way she had arranged to find it, a specific bundle of herbs from a specific vendor, wrapped in a specific color of paper, left in the pocket of a coat she had left with the laundry. She unfolded the inner paper in her rooms with the door locked and the fire burning to destroy it after. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. The people who had sent her were not a foreign government. She had believed they were, had been told they were, had been given the framing of political necessity, a rival power seeking to shift the regional balance. This was the kind of assignment she had taken before, the kind she had made her private peace with, because in the large chess game of political power, kings were players, not innocents. The people who had sent her were the northern noble families, the ones who had lost land in the reforms, the ones who stood to regain it if the king who had taken it from them was removed. She burned the paper. She sat for a long time. She was not naive about the work she did. She had no comfortable illusions about the nature of the organization she worked for, or the purity of the causes she had served. She had chosen survival over ethics at 18, and she had been making the same choice in smaller increments ever since. This was the architecture of her life, and she had been honest with herself about it, because the only thing worse than the choices she made was making them and pretending they were something else. But she had a line. She did not remove people who were doing something good from the world on behalf of people who were doing something worse. This was the line. She had kept it for 8 years. She looked at the frost on the window. She thought about the northern farmland, the families on it, the policy that had put them there. She thought about Edvin in the library explaining 30 years of records with precise devotion. She thought about a 23-year-old king coming to the garden every morning, because it was the only place that did not want anything from him. She thought about amber eyes and a frost-covered oak tree, and I'd rather be examined honestly than trusted blindly. She made a decision. It was not a small decision. It was the kind that changed the shape of everything after it, the kind you could not take back, and she made it with the same quiet precision with which she made all her decisions, turning it over fully, seeing all its edges, and then setting it down as a fixed point. She was not going to complete this assignment. She was also, now, a problem for the people who had sent her. She knew too much about who they were and what they wanted. The second assassin, the one who came after failures, would have 2 targets now. She had perhaps 2 days before the deadline. She needed to think. She went to dinner and performed Lady Voss with flawless calm and watched him at the head of the table and thought about the specific complexity of what she was now doing and was not doing and was going to have to do. After dinner, she stood at the bookshelves with the Eastern Territories history and felt him cross the room toward her and thought, I have to tell him something. Not everything, but enough. He arrived at the shelves. Something is wrong, he said, not a question. She looked at him. Your Majesty, not the court version, he said quietly. Whatever you're about to say, I'd prefer the direct one. She looked at his face. The amber eyes, direct and steady, the expression that had seemed like recognition from the very first morning in the garden and which she now understood was exactly that he had been reading her, not Lady Voss, her, the actual person beneath the performance, since the first moment in the frost. She made a smaller decision inside the large one. I need to speak with you privately, she said. Not tonight. Tomorrow morning. The garden. He held her gaze for a long moment. I'll be there, he said. She nodded. She replaced the book on the shelf. She walked back to her rooms with the careful composure of someone whose entire situation had just restructured itself entirely, and who was not going to let that show until she was alone. She sat in the dark and was honest with herself. She was about to confess to a king that she had arrived at his court to kill him. She was about to trust him with this because the alternative was worse, and because everything she had learned in 4 days told her he was someone who could be trusted with difficult truths. She was also about to trust him with this because she could not make herself be the reason those amber eyes stopped existing in the world. She acknowledged this. She was nothing if not honest with herself in the dark. Then she prepared for the morning. The garden was colder than it had been. A new frost had come overnight, thicker than the previous ones, and the oak tree was entirely white now, every branch outlined in ice that caught the early light and threw it in small, cold sparks. She arrived first and stood at the tree and looked at it and thought that she had been looking at this tree for 4 mornings, and each time it had shown her something different. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path. She turned. He was alone. She had not been certain he would come alone, had thought he might bring guards, or an advisor, some protective intelligence at work after her request for privacy. He had come alone, his breath misting in the cold air, his dark coat open in the way she was learning meant he had come directly from somewhere rather than planned for the cold. He stopped a few feet away. She looked at him. She had rehearsed this. She had constructed several versions of it overnight, ordered by efficiency, by strategic value, by how much truth each version contained. She had a version that revealed the minimum and achieved the necessary outcome. She had a version that was fully honest and left her entirely exposed. She looked at his face and discarded all the versions. My name is not Sarah Voss, she said. The frost breathed around them. My name is Sarah. The rest is not mine. I arrived here 7 days ago. Today is the 7th day with forged letters of introduction and instructions to poison you before the deadline. She watched him. His expression did not change in the way she expected, not toward anger, not toward the reaching for guards response she was braced for. Something else moved in his face, something she could not fully read, the complex processing of information that was both received and already suspected. The people who sent me are the northern noble families, she continued. The ones who lost land in your reforms. This is not a political assassination. It is property recovery dressed as one. I discovered this on the 4th day. It changed my position. He was very still. I am telling you because you have 2 days before they send someone else, someone who will not have developed reservations. And because she stopped. Because I decided 4 days ago that I was not going to complete this assignment, and I have spent those days trying to find a way through that did not require this conversation, and I could not find one. She held his gaze. She said, I understand if your response to this is to have me arrested. That is the logical response, and I have no argument against it. The garden was silent around them. The frost-covered oak stood its white patient ground. He looked at her for a long time, those amber eyes, direct and steady and doing something she could not name. "What is your real name?" he asked. "Sarah," she said. "That part is real. How long have you been doing this work?" 8 years. Since you were 18. She exhaled. Yes, he looked at the oak tree. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she had time to run through the outcomes again in her mind and find all of them equally uncomfortable. Then he said, "I knew you weren't who you said you were." From the first morning, she stared at him. "Not specifically," he said. "Not what you were, I didn't know that. But Lady Voss was a performance and you were not. The performance was excellent. But there was someone behind it, and the person behind it was," he paused, choosing the word present in a way that people who are simply what they appear rarely are. She did not know what to say. "You watched everything," he said, not with a guest's curiosity, with a professional's assessment. "I've had guards for 15 years, and I know how people look at a room when they're mapping it," she said, "and yet you walked in the garden with me." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He looked at her directly. "Because whoever you were and whatever you came here to do, the person in the garden was real. The questions about governance were real. The mountains were real." She looked at the frost on the oak tree. "And I have been," he said quietly, "considerably more careful in every room of my life than in that garden. For a very long time." He did not have her arrested. She had prepared for the possibility with the detached practicality of someone who had spent 8 years preparing for the worst outcomes of every situation, and the absence of it left her with a strange lightness, as if she had been braced against a weight that had been lifted without warning. What he did instead was take her to the study, not the formal one, the public-facing room she had mapped on her first day. The private one, on the upper floor, book-lined and fire-warmed and smelling of old paper in a way she recognized from every library she had ever disappeared into when her real life became too much to stand inside. He sat across the desk from her and said, "Tell me everything you know about who sent you. Names, if you have them. Connections, the structure of it." She told him. Everything she had found in the message, everything she had assembled before that, from the pattern of evidence that hadn't quite fit the story she'd been given. She was precise and thorough, and she did not soften anything. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the fire. "3 of those names I know," he said. "I've been watching them since the land reforms. I didn't have enough to move against them." "You do now," she said. "If my testimony is worth anything." He looked at her. "Why would you testify against the people who employed you?" "Because they lied to me about what I was being asked to do," she said, and because she stopped. He waited. "Because I have a line," she said finally, "that they crossed." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "You've done this work for 8 years," he said. "Not a judgment, simply a statement of fact. Yes, and you have never been caught." "No," he leaned forward. "What do you want, Sarah? Not what you think I'll accept, or what's strategically optimal. What do you actually want?" The question arrived with the same precision as all his questions, finding the thing she had not said and asking about it directly. She looked at the fire. She had not been asked this question in 8 years, possibly longer. "To stop," she said. She had not known she was going to say it until she said it. "I have wanted to stop for a long time, and I have not had a way out that didn't lead somewhere worse." He was quiet. The fire settled in the grate. "There is a unit," he said carefully. "An investigative one. They work on exactly the kind of activity you've described, the network that employed you, the noble families using private contractors for political removal. I've been trying to build a case for 3 years, and the central problem has been that I don't have anyone who has been inside it. She looked at him. I'm not asking you for anything, he said. I want to be clear. You came here and told me the truth when you didn't have to. You owe me nothing. But, she said. But, he continued, if you wanted a different kind of work that uses what you know, that goes toward something, rather than away from it, that option exists. With full protection, and after it's done, if you want to stop entirely, that would also be arranged. She studied him. You're offering me a way out, she said. I'm offering you a choice, he said. Which is different. She thought about 18 years old and 2 options, and choosing the one that kept her alive. She thought about 8 years of becoming other people and walking away. She thought about the doubt she had packed, without telling anyone, and the line she had drawn for herself and the ways she had bent toward it over the years, the slow erosion of the version of herself she had originally been. She thought about the garden. The frost on the oak tree, a version of herself she had not performed, just inhabited, briefly in the early mornings when the court had not yet assembled. What guarantees do I have? She asked. His word, he said, which I understand is not a legal document, but I have found it to be more durable than most. She looked at his face, the amber eyes, direct and serious and carrying the same quality she had noticed from the very first morning, the quality of meaning what he said. She exhaled slowly. All right, she said. He nodded. One more thing. She waited. The person who comes after you, the second contractor. Do you know when they'll be sent? At midnight tomorrow if I haven't reported completion. He stood. Then we have time, but not much. He moved to the door, then stopped. He looked back at her. You told me the truth, he said. I want you to know that I understand what that cost. She held his gaze. I'm not sure I know yet what it cost, she said honestly. I'll have to see what's left after. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was complex and warm and entirely unguarded. Then he opened the door and went to work. The next 36 hours were the most structured she had experienced in 8 years. There was a meeting with the head of the investigative unit, a compact, precise woman named Commander Wraith, who looked at Sarah with the flat professional assessment of someone who had seen everything and was reserving judgment until the evidence was complete. Sarah gave her everything: names, methods, the communication system, the network's internal structure as she understood it, the gaps in her knowledge mapped as carefully as the knowledge itself. She answered every question directly. She offered no mitigation. Commander Wraith listened without expression, and at the end said, "This is more than we've had in 3 years." Then she stood, nodded once, and left the room. There was a legal meeting, which was uncomfortable in a different way, the careful construction of a protection arrangement that required her to testify against her former employers in exchange for immunity and resettlement. She signed the documents with the hand that had carried the vial and thought about the distance between that hand and this one. There was the matter of the second contractor. The king handled this himself, which she had not expected. He did not send subordinates. He coordinated with Commander Wraith's unit through the night to identify the most likely route of the incoming operative and set a reception that was clean and contained and resulted, she learned the following morning, in an arrest rather than anything worse. She was glad of this. She did not know who had been sent. She had been on both ends of the second contractor equation before, and she preferred this outcome. She slept deeply that night for the first time in a week. In the morning, she went to the garden. She was not certain she would be welcome there now. The garden felt like it belonged to a version of the previous days, the Lady Voss days. The version where she had been performing and he had been reading her through the performance, and she was not sure what it meant now that the performance was gone. He was there. He was at the oak tree, which had shed most of its frost in the morning sun, the branches returning to their natural dark color, the architecture of the thing revealed without the white outline. "You came," he said. She stopped beside him. "The garden smells different," she said. "Without the frost." "Yes," he agreed. "More like itself." She looked at the oak tree. She thought, "More like itself." "Yes," she said. "I am not sure what happens now. Practically, I understand the legal arrangement. I understand what the testimony will involve. I don't have a clear picture of the daily reality." He turned to face her. "You have rooms here until the case is concluded. You have a position with Commander Wraith's unit in whatever capacity you're willing to take. After that, as I said, there are options." She nodded. She looked at the tree. "I don't know who I am outside the work," she said. This was true in a way she rarely allowed herself to say out loud. "I have been other people for so long that the original is," she paused, "not gone, but not entirely accessible." He looked at her. "I understand that," he said. "Specifically, not as a general sympathy." She looked at him. "I have been a king since I was 23, he said. "Before that I was a person, and I can still locate him, but he is not immediately at hand. He has been under the king for a long time." She thought about the garden. The reason they both came here. The space that did not want anything from either of them. "Is that why you come here?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "and because the frost does interesting things to the oak tree." She almost smiled. The anterior of one. He looked at her with the amber eyes and said, "I found you real from the first morning. Whatever you were pretending to be, the person in the garden was real, and she was someone I wanted to know." She held his gaze. "She is still here," Sarah said quietly. "That person. She just doesn't have a great deal of practice being visible." He nodded. "Then we have time," he said. "And a garden." She looked at the oak tree. The branches moved in a slight wind, the last of the frost falling in small, bright pieces. She thought, "I came here to end a life, and instead something else entirely is beginning." She thought, "I am not sure I know how to hold this carefully enough." She thought, "I am going to learn." She stayed. Not the way she had stayed in other places provisionally, one eye on the exit, her real self packed and ready to move at the first signal. She stayed the way she had not stayed anywhere since she was a child, with some tentative and frightening version of permanence, letting the days accumulate into something that began to feel like a life rather than a position. The testimony took 3 weeks. Commander Wraith was thorough and demanding, which Sarah respected. She did not want thoroughness she did not respect to be responsible for the outcome. She gave everything she had, which was considerable, and she watched the case build from the inside with the particular satisfaction of someone who understood the architecture of the network she was dismantling. The noble families were arrested on a cold, clear morning in the 5th week. All of them. The speed of it, once the case was complete, was striking. She had expected legal hesitation, political negotiation, the softening that came when powerful people were implicated. There was none of it. He moved quickly and without apology, and the thing was done. She watched from the window of the east wing as the carriages departed. Commander Wraith found her there. The commander stood beside her for a moment, also watching. "You did good work," Wraith said. It was not effusive. It was precise, which was how Sarah preferred it. "What happens to the network?" Sarah asked. "With its primary funders removed and its primary operative turned," Wraith said, "it will fragment. There are others we'll need to track." She paused. "I would like you to continue working with the unit. If you're willing." Sarah looked at the empty courtyard where the carriages had been. "Yes," she said. She was surprised to find she meant it. The work was different. Not the absence of difficulty, it was frequently difficult. The investigation of networks like the one she had come from required moving through uncomfortable knowledge and sitting with evidence that had human cost attached to it. but it was pointed in a direction she could see, toward something rather than simply away from something else. She found she was good at it, in ways she had not been good at the previous work, not the execution, but the investigation, the reading of patterns, the patient assembly of incomplete information into a coherent picture. Wraith told her she thought differently than most investigators. Sarah said she had spent 8 years being paid to think like the people she was sent to find. Wraith said that was exactly the point. She and the king continued to meet in the garden. Not every morning the case had consumed his time and hers, and the court's schedule made the early mornings inconsistent. But when they both appeared, the meeting had the quality of something that had become its own ritual, a space outside the rest of their respective lives, where they were simply two people who found the same garden worthwhile for the same reason. He told her about a governance decision he was struggling with, a treaty proposal from the western provinces that would benefit the outer territories but at a cost to the trade relationships that funded half the capital's infrastructure. He laid it out honestly, not asking for a solution, simply thinking aloud. She said, "You're describing a short-term cost for a long-term benefit, and the people who will bear the short-term cost are not the same people who will receive the long-term benefit." He looked at her. "That's exactly the problem," he said, "and the reason it's difficult to defend publicly." She thought about it. "Then you need to make the long-term beneficiaries present in the conversation," she said. "People support costs they understand as investments. They resist costs that appear to benefit someone else. The framing is not dishonest, the benefit is real, but the current framing buries the beneficiaries in abstraction." He was very still. He said, "I have advisors who have been trying to solve this problem for 2 months. She said, "I spent 8 years understanding how people make decisions under pressure. It's not entirely different." He looked at her with the amber eyes and said, "No, I don't think it is." She looked at the garden. Spring was beginning the first green, showing through the last of the cold. The oak tree putting out its early leaves, the whole frozen world remembering itself. She thought about the line she had drawn for herself 8 years ago, and the ways she had bent toward it, and the ways she had not. She thought about arriving here with a vial and a deadline, and leaving with something she did not have a word for yet. She thought about the doubt she had packed without telling anyone, how it had been the most honest thing about her, and she had not known that until it had led her to this garden. She looked at his profile in the spring light. She thought, "I am glad I came here. I am glad I was sent here with the worst intention and found the best outcome. I am glad the doubt was in me before I arrived." She thought, "I am going to need to tell him that eventually." She was working up to it. Spring arrived in Ostroven the way it arrived in high-elevation places, not gradually, but in sudden decisive steps, as if the cold had been holding everything back by force and had one day simply let go. The gardens transformed overnight. The oak tree leafed fully within a week. The frost that had defined her first mornings here became a memory, which she found strange how completely a place could change its character and remain itself. She had been at the palace for 3 months. She thought about this sometimes with the quiet surprise of someone who had not intended to stay anywhere for longer than the job required. 3 months in one place, in one name, being one person. She had expected it to feel like confinement. It did not feel like confinement. It felt, tentatively and with the caution of someone who had been wrong about the nature of things before, like the beginning of something she did not have a good word for yet. The unit had given her a formal position, investigator, which was a clean and accurate description of what she did. She investigated networks, the kind that operated in the spaces between official oversight, and she was good at it with a consistency that Commander Wraith acknowledged in the particular way Wraith acknowledged things, which was by asking her to do more of them. She had her own rooms now, not the guest suite, a smaller set of rooms in the East Wing that belonged to no category she had previously occupied, neither servant nor noble, a new category that the palace was apparently flexible enough to accommodate. She had her own books. This was the thing that felt most real to her, the accumulation of books that were actually hers, that she had chosen and read and kept, that sat on the shelf and represented a continuous self rather than a temporarily occupied space. The Eastern Mountain history was there, both parts of it. She had not told him yet. She was still working up to it. On an evening in late spring, she found him in the garden after the court dinner, sitting on the low bench by the oak tree, which was in full leaf now, its shadow long and green across the gravel. He had a document in his hand, but he was not reading it. He was looking at the garden with the expression she had catalogued as processing, and she walked to the bench and sat beside him. He set the document aside. They sat in the green evening quiet. She said, "I want to tell you something." He turned. "I have been trying to tell you for several weeks," she said. "I have constructed a number of versions of it and discarded them all because they were either insufficient or they were performing something rather than simply saying it." He was looking at her with full attention. She looked at the oak tree. "When I came here," she said, "I was prepared to complete the assignment. I had done this work for 8 years without exception, and I had convinced myself that the doubt I was carrying was a liability rather than an intelligence. I planned to manage it. I planned to get close to you and find the window and execute the outcome and leave." She paused. "I could not do it," she said. "Not because I was caught or stopped, or because the logistics failed. I could not do it because 4 days was enough time to understand that you were someone who should exist in the world, and because the doubt turned out to be the most honest thing about me, and it was telling me the truth." She turned to look at him. He was very still, listening in the complete way he had. "I am telling you this," she said, "because you gave me something no one has given me in a very long time. You looked at me, not Lady Voss, me, and you saw something worth knowing. And you told me I had time to decide things properly. And you offered me a choice instead of an outcome." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that I would have chosen differently even without the evidence about the northern families," she said. "Even if they had been exactly who I was told they were, I would not have been able to complete the assignment. Because of you specifically." The garden was very quiet. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I know." She blinked. "I've known since the library," he said quietly. "You spent your 4th day in the archives building a case about my governance before you found out who sent you. You were deciding before the evidence arrived. The evidence confirmed what you had already decided." She stared at him. "I didn't say anything," he said, "because it was yours to say. I didn't want to take it from you." She thought about all the versions she had constructed and discarded. She thought about weeks of working up to it. "You have known for 2 months," she said. "Yes, and you waited." "Yes," he looked at her steadily. "You needed to find your way to it. Arriving isn't the same as being ready." She looked at the oak tree in full spring leaf, the same tree she had first seen in frost, white and outlined and showing its bones. The same tree entirely transformed and entirely itself. She said, "I don't have a great deal of experience with people who are patient with me." He said, quietly, "I know that too." She looked at his face, the amber eyes, warm and direct and carrying the recognition she had felt from the first morning, the recognition that had unnerved her because she had not understood it, and which she understood now, which was that he had seen her from the beginning, the actual her, and had been waiting without pressure for her to be able to see herself the same way. She said, "I am not easy to know. I have spent 8 years being someone other than myself, and the original is not fully assembled yet." He said, "I am not asking for fully assembled. I am asking for present." She held his gaze. "I can be present," she said. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. The spring evening moved around them, green and warm, and the oak tree held its full canopy against the fading light, and she thought that she had arrived here in frost and was still here in the green, and that this was not a small thing. Summer came to Astrovan, and she was still there. She had stopped measuring her presence in terms of how long she had stayed, which she recognized as a significant shift the way people stopped counting days somewhere when the counting became unnecessary, because the staying was no longer provisional. She was not leaving. She knew this the way she knew the geography of the palace now, not as information she had collected, but as something she simply inhabited. The investigative work had expanded. The fragmented network she had helped dismantle had connections to 3 neighboring states, which meant the case had grown beyond the initial scope, which meant Commander Wraith needed more people with the specific skill set Sarah represented, which meant she spent a great deal of her time training junior investigators in the reading of patterns and the inhabiting of cover identities, and the particular art of being present in a room without being seen. She was a better teacher than she had expected. She understood the skill from the inside, which made her explanations precise, and she understood the psychological cost of it, which made her instructions honest about what it required and what it took. One of the junior investigators asked her how she had gotten into the work. She said, "I was given 2 options at 18 and chose the one that kept me alive." The investigator looked at her. "And now?" she asked. Sarah looked at the training room, the case maps on the walls, the careful assembly of evidence that went toward something rather than away. "Now I have more than 2 options," she said. She and Aldrich, she had begun to call him Aldrich. In private, the private name that was not the title, the same way he had been calling her Sarah from the first morning, as if her real name had been the only possible one to use, continued the garden and the conversations and the slow particular building of something she still did not have a perfect word for, though she was getting closer. They were careful with it, not because either of them was uncertain, but because they both understood the weight of it and did not want to move faster than the thing could bear. He was still a king. She was still, technically, someone who had arrived at his court to poison him. The world had opinions about both these facts, and they were not unaware of the opinions. They simply held the thing carefully and let it develop at its own pace. There was an evening in midsummer when the court was attending an outdoor event, and they had found themselves together on the roof garden above the east wing, which was a small private space that neither of them had known the other used until they both arrived, for the same reason the view of the mountains, visible on clear evenings, the long dark line of them against the sky. She told him about growing up near them. Not the constructed version, the performance-enhanced details she had used in the Lady Voss days. The real version, which was less poetic and more specific, the actual cold, the actual silence, the particular way her mother had moved through a kitchen, the exact quality of the light on winter mornings that she had never stopped measuring other winter mornings against. He listened. Then he told her about his father, who had been a king who had known he was a king in every cell of his body and had found his son's uncertainty about the role baffling, who had tried to prepare him with efficiency rather than warmth and had left him, at 23, technically well-trained and personally unprepared. "I think," Aldrich said, "that I have been trying to be a person as well as a king since I was 23, and it has taken me until recently to understand that those 2 things are not actually in conflict." She looked at the mountains. "I have been trying to be a person rather than a function since I arrived here," she said, with varying success. He looked at her. "You have considerably more success than you recognize." She thought about the garden, the books on the shelf, the junior investigators she trained, who came to her with questions and left with better questions. The morning coffee that belonged to no one but her. She said, "I want to tell you something." He turned. She said, "I have been in love with you for some time." I know that is, she paused a sentence that comes with considerable freight, given the specific history of how I arrived here and what I was sent to do. But I have spent a long time being precise about what is real and what is performance, and this is real. I want you to have the direct version of it. The mountains stood dark and patient in the summer sky. He looked at her with the amber eyes and said, I have been in love with you since you told me the oak tree looked like a map. She stared at him. That was the first morning, she said. You had known me for 10 minutes. He said, I know what I saw. She thought about 10 minutes in a frost-white garden and a woman who had come to kill him, who he had looked at with recognition rather than the performed assessment of power, who he had walked beside through the gravel paths as if this were the most natural arrangement of two people in the world. She said, That is either deeply impractical or deeply accurate. He said, In my experience, those are often the same thing. She looked at him. She thought about 18 years old and 2 options. She thought about 8 years of other people and other names and the careful erosion of the version of herself she had originally been. She thought about arriving here in frost carrying a vial and a deadline and the doubt she had packed without telling anyone. She thought about the doubt, the most honest thing about her, the thing that had brought her here, to this roof, to this summer, to this man who had looked at her from the first morning and refused to see anything other than what was actually there. She reached out and took his hand. The mountains were dark shapes against a darkening sky. The summer evening was warm around them. The palace breathed below them. She thought, I came here to end something. Instead, I found the beginning. Autumn came, and she was still there, and she had stopped being surprised by this. The noble family case concluded in the first week of the season. Trials, convictions, the formal legal architecture of accountability that was slower and more bureaucratic than any of her previous experiences of consequence, but considerably more durable. She testified twice, in precise, measured language, and answered every question directly, and watched the case close with the particular satisfaction of something completed properly. Commander Wraith told her afterward, in the corridor outside the court chamber, that she was the best investigator in the unit. Sarah said, You told me you were reserving judgment. Wraith said, I've delivered it. She went back to work. The unit had 3 active cases, 2 of which touched the same type of private network she had come from, and the work was demanding and frequently dark, and she was good at it, and it mattered, which was the combination she had not had before and which she understood now was not a small thing. She trained the junior investigators. She walked in the garden. She read books that were actually hers. She had, without fully planning it, built a life. On an evening in early autumn, she and Aldrich were in the private study, the real one, the upper one with the worn books and the fire, the first room she had ever sat in as herself rather than as a performance, and he was working through a governance document and she was reading. And the room had the quality of settled quiet that comes from 2 people who have been in the same space enough times that their silences have become familiar. He set down the document. She looked up. He said, I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it directly, because you have told me you prefer directness, and I have found that to be true. And I have also found that some things lose their precision when they are approached at an angle. She closed her book. He looked at her steadily. I want you to stay, he said, not as an investigator, though I hope you'll continue that work because you're extraordinary at it. Not as a court guest or a protected witness or any category the palace has an existing name for. I want you to stay, as he paused, choosing, as the person I want to build the rest of my life beside. The fire moved in the grate. She looked at him. She thought about every version of her life she had inhabited, the real one and the performed ones. She thought about the girl who had been given 2 options and chosen survival, and the woman who had been given better options and was learning, slowly, to choose them without bracing for the catch. She thought about a frost-white garden and an oak tree and a man who had looked at her with recognition and refused to look away. She thought about the doubt she had packed, the most honest thing about her. She was grateful for it every day. She said, I want to stay. I have wanted to stay since the first time I left the garden and walked back into the palace and felt, for the first time in 8 years, that I was walking toward something rather than away from it. He looked at her. She said, I need you to know that the person you are asking is not fully assembled yet. I am still, she looked for the word, finding my way back to myself after a long time of being other people. There are parts of me I haven't accessed in years, and I don't know all of them clearly yet. He said, I know. And I am telling you that I want to know those parts as you find them. I am not asking for a complete person. I am asking for the person who is present and continuing, whoever she turns out to be. She held his gaze. Then yes, she said, completely and without the versions I usually construct. Yes, he rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat and took her face in his hands with the care of someone handling something of genuine value, and she looked up at him and thought that she had arrived here carrying the worst intention and found the best outcome, and that the distance between those two things was the most remarkable geography she had ever crossed. He kissed her, warm and certain and entirely unperformed. Outside, the autumn evening settled over Astroven. The oak tree in the garden held its changing leaves amber and gold now, the same colors as his eyes, she thought, and the thought made her press closer to him because she was in love and allowed to be obvious about it. The palace breathed around them. She thought about the mountains she had grown up near, and the girl she had been before the options narrowed, and the woman she had become inside the narrowing. She thought about doubt and honesty, and the things you carry without telling anyone that turn out, in the end, to be the most important things you bring. She thought about a king who had looked at her from the first morning and refused to die, not because she had failed, because she had been seen. And seeing, she had made the only choice that was worth making. She held his hands against her face and felt the fire warm and the room real, and the future very large and not frightening at all. She was present. Fully, for the first time in a very long time. And it was enough. It was, in fact, everything.